Ever since I turned 19, my parents started treating me like a ghost, the kind they hoped would just fade away rather than haunt anyone. I didn't realize how invisible I had become until that Christmas when my brother Kyle unwrapped a $2,000 gaming setup while I received a $50 gift card to a grocery store. My mom remarked that since I was older, I didn't need toys, even though I had been saving every spare dollar to buy a laptop for community college. I didn't say anything because complaining never worked when you were the afterthought. During dinner, Kyle smirked at me, his new headset draped over his neck like a trophy. He mocked me by giving me the nickname Budget Brian, and even when my mom half-heartedly tried to correct him, his laughter only grew. My dad simply shrugged and dismissed it as harmless. I tried to laugh it off, but my face burned. Later on, when I went to the kitchen to get my gift card, I discovered it was gone, only to find it later in the trash, torn clean in half. I confronted Kyle in his room where he was busy setting up his new rig. He didn't even look up from his keyboard and casually suggested that I had probably lost it, as if he had rehearsed the line. My mom refused to believe that he might have done it and instead accused me of stirring up drama. My dad simply handed me a crumpled $20 from his wallet, telling me to move on. It wasn't the money that hurt, it was the feeling that they didn't care enough to even notice. The next day, Kyle's brand new headphones disappeared. Kyle stormed into the living room, pointing at me and accusing me of stealing them and being jealous. My dad didn't hesitate. He marched into my room and ransacked my things while I stood there frozen. When he found the headphones hidden under my bed, it felt like a punch to the gut. It was clear that Kyle had planted them while I was at my part-time job that morning. I tried to explain myself, but my dad's face reddened as he accused me of being both a liar and a thief. Then he hit me. It wasn't a mere slap, but a sharp, deliberate backhand that snapped my head to the side. I stumbled into the wall, my cheek throbbing. My mom never looked up from her phone. Something inside me snapped. I shoved my dad hard, and he crashed against the dresser. He labeled me a violent psycho and threatened to kick me out, and in that moment, I almost wished he had. That night, my Uncle Rick showed up unannounced to borrow a socket wrench. Dad's younger brother, known for fixing cars and never asking too many questions, arrived with a friendly demeanor that quickly vanished when he saw the bruise on my face. He ended up staying for coffee, despite my mom frequently glancing at the clock. Meanwhile, I could hear Dad in the kitchen ranting about how I had attacked him, and Rick's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. The next morning, Rick offered to take me fishing, and my mom agreed immediately, almost as if she wanted me to be gone. In his truck, with no radio on, Rick remarked that my dad had been the golden child too. Apparently, Grandpa had always poured everything into Dad, paying for college tuition and a down payment on his first house, while Rick struggled, working 2 jobs to fix his own busted pickup. He mused that history was repeating itself. I told Rick about the missing headphones, the ruined gift card, and how Kyle's smirk never left his face. Rick sighed and explained that my dad believed he was protecting Kyle, thinking that by giving him everything, Kyle wouldn't turn bitter. His words carried a heavy truth, and he avoided meeting my eyes as he spoke. After we returned, Rick dragged my dad into the garage, and their voices escalated until my dad shouted that he was failing both his sons. The door slammed shut afterward, and Rick left without saying goodbye. Later, I overheard Kyle leaning over the stair railing, murmuring that nobody believed me. I believed him. Now, I sit in my room, typing on a cracked phone screen. Rick had texted me an hour ago asking if I was okay, but I haven't replied. I don't know what will happen next, but I know I can't stay here. Kyle was right. No one was truly listening. Not yet. Perhaps that was the worst part. Not the hit, nor the ruined $50 gift card, but the silence. The way my mom stared right through me, and the way my dad looked at me afterward, as if I were a stranger. I wasn't sure whether Rick would help me, or if I was on my own, but one thing was clear. I couldn't remain a ghost any longer. After all, ghosts don't eat. They don't need laptops, and they certainly don't get to live a life. Now for the first update. A week has passed since I last posted. I didn't think things could get worse, but living here feels like walking on a tightrope that someone is actively loosening. After the blow-up with my dad, Uncle Rick started sending me job leads. He owns an auto shop and offered me part-time work, oil changes, tire rotations, basic stuff. He mentioned that it wasn't fancy, but that it put cash in my pocket. I didn't realize my mom was monitoring my phone until she stormed into my room, gripping her coffee mug as if she might throw it. She demanded that I stop dragging Rick into my lies and warned that I was turning everyone against us. I didn't bother arguing, because arguing only meant more noise, and noise meant my dad would get involved. A couple of days later, Kyle accidentally spilled an entire mug of coffee on my work uniform. I just started a weekend gig at a hardware store, stocking shelves overnight, and the uniform, a navy polo, and stiff khakis, was only a loner. While I was lacing my boots, Kyle dumped his drink right down the front of it and gave a casual shrug, as if it was nothing. I shoved past him to rinse the fabric in the sink, but the stains wouldn't budge. My mom refused to drive me to buy a new one, remarking that I should have been more careful while barely looking up from her crossword. I ended up missing my shift, and later my boss left a voicemail warning that one more no-show would be the end of it. The next morning, Rick showed up with a spare uniform from his shop. It was too big, he's 6 inches taller, but he had safety pinned the sleeves to make it work. My mom sat at the kitchen table with her lips pressed into a thin line, watching Rick as if he had brought a stray dog into the house. That night, I overheard my dad on the phone with someone, maybe his brother, maybe a friend. I caught him muttering that Brian was unstable and that they might need to change the locks. My chest went cold. I'd been saving cash from the hardware store job in an old shoebox under my bed, but it wasn't nearly enough for any deposit. When I told Rick about it, he drove me to a credit union the next day and helped me open an account. It turned out my dad still controlled the savings account from high school, the one I'd used for birthday money and lawn mowing cash. Rick reminded me that I was 19 now, that legally it was mine, and assured me that we would figure it out. The following morning, I found Kyle's Christmas receipt in the kitchen trash. Apparently, he had returned an entire $2,000 gaming setup for cash the week before, a date that lined up with the day Rick first texted me. I stormed into the living room, the receipt trembling in my hand, and demanded to know why my mom had let him do it. She was folding laundry, carefully smoothing the wrinkles from my dad's shirts, and snapped at me, telling me to stop obsessing over my brother's possessions and accusing me of always trying to start something. That evening, Rick took me out to dinner at a diner off the highway, the kind with sticky menus and coffee that tastes like burnt toast. Halfway through my pancakes, I admitted that I was scared I'd end up sleeping in my car. My voice cracked as tears welled up, and Rick slid a napkin across the table. He told me to stay in his guest room until I got on my feet, and then quietly mentioned that we needed solid proof, something my parents couldn't twist. I started recording every argument. At first, it was just my dad's rants about respect and my mom's passive-aggressive sighs, but then, a few days ago, Kyle brought his friend Jake over. They were in the backyard while I was on the other side of the fence taking out the trash. I heard Kyle let out a sharp, mean laugh, and from what I gathered, he was bragging about framing someone for cash, calling it the easiest $2,000 he ever made. I managed to record the audio even though my thumb fumbled a bit. When I played the recording for Rick, I noticed his face tense as he kept rewinding the part where Kyle claimed that Dad would never believe him because he was the favorite. Eventually, Rick rubbed his temples and decided it was time to end this mess. Later that night, Rick drove to my parents' house. I waited in the truck with the engine off as he went inside. Through the window, I could see my dad with his arms crossed and my mom hovering behind him like a shadow. Inside, Rick played the recording. My dad's voice rose as he accused someone of editing it and insisted that Kyle was a good kid, while my mom pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and logged into Kyle's bank account, the screen lighting up in her hands. It turned out that Kyle had spent the entire $2,000 on a sleeve tattoo, a dragon design, and front row tickets to a concert from just the previous weekend. My mom let out a sound as if all the air had been knocked out of her, then slapped Kyle hard. He stumbled back, clutching his face, and shouted that Dad had given him free rein to do whatever he wanted. I still don't know what happens next. Rick's guest room has a fold-out couch that sags right in the middle, but I've been able to sleep through the night for the first time in months. My dad hasn't called, and my mom texted once saying that we needed to talk, a message I left on read. By the way, Kyle's tattoo is a mess. The dragon's scales look more like fish fins, and I guess $2,000 doesn't buy what it used to anymore. Now for the second update. It's been 2 weeks since my last update. A lot of people asked if I managed to leave. Turns out, leaving was the easy part. Staying away? That's where things got messy. After the slap incident, Dad doubled down. He refused to punish Kyle and claimed that boys make mistakes, arguing that stealing $2,000 and framing me was just a teenage hiccup. But when I shoved him, that was considered a capital offense. Then Rick intervened, telling Dad that he would call CPS if he didn't agree to family therapy. Dad just laughed with his arms crossed, as if Rick were a kid threatening to tattle, and told him to go ahead, so Rick did. The CPS caseworker arrived 3 days later. Mom answered the door wearing her Sunday best, all smiles, and lied right to his face, claiming that I had hurt myself for attention. The caseworker, a woman with tired eyes carrying a clipboard, asked to speak with me alone. We sat in my room, the one Mom had already begun packing up, with half my clothes thrown into garbage bags. I showed her the audio recording of Kyle bragging about the setup and the bank statements that Rick had helped me print. After a pause, she remarked in surprise that I had been keeping track of all this myself. I nodded, too choked up to speak. Kyle was shipped off to our aunt's house the next day. Temporary placement, they called it. Dad blamed me at the door in a low, frayed tone, accusing me of tearing the family apart. Mom didn't say anything, just kept folding my socks into neat little squares while avoiding eye contact. When I left with my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, she was scrubbing the kitchen counter as if it owed her money. Rick's guest room smelled like motor oil and old paperbacks. The first night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and waiting for the yelling to start. But it was quiet, just the hum of the fridge downstairs. Rick gave me 30 hours a week at his shop, having me sweep floors, organize tools, and do anything to keep busy. He made it clear that I needed to earn my keep and warned me not to skip class. A week later, Dad texted, telling me to come home and apologize or not to expect any help with tuition. I ended up blocking his number. It felt like cutting a rope I'd been hanging on for years. Soon, my aunt called and mentioned that Kyle was failing 2 classes and sneaking out at night. She snapped that she was done babysitting a brat. I almost felt bad for her until I recalled how, at Christmas, she had laughed when Kyle had nicknamed me Budget Brian. Mom showed up at the shop last Tuesday. I was under a sedan, checking the oil pan, when I heard her heels click against the concrete. She told me that I needed to fix it, as if I had broken a toaster. Rick stepped in between us with his arms crossed, insisting that I was working and telling her to leave. After a brief exchange, she walked out, and for a second I thought I saw her chin wobble. Later, I overheard Rick arguing with Dad over the phone. Rick questioned why Kyle wasn't saving for community college like I was, insinuating that he might be involved with drugs. Dad abruptly hung up on him. The financial aid office said I now qualified as independent. The word felt heavy, like a door slamming shut, as I filled out the forms in Rick's kitchen with shaking hands. Then Kyle crashed Dad's car, wrapping it around a stop sign at 2 a.m. while drunk. Dad paid to keep it quiet, but according to Aunt Linda, he eventually yelled at Kyle to grow up. Kyle ended up crying to Mom, who unblocked me just long enough to beg for family forgiveness. I responded with a firm no and blocked her again. Rick's mechanic friends donated old tools, a dented toolbox, a jack, and wrenches with chipped handles. I've been fixing bikes on weekends and charging $20 each time. The first time someone paid me, a guy with a rusty Schwinn, I almost ended up handing the cash back because it felt like play money. My first real paycheck from the shop was $427.59. Rick insisted that I endorse the check in my name, making it clear it was mine and no one else's. I then drove to a pawn shop and bought a used laptop, a dented Dell with a battery that only lasted 3 hours. I sat in the parking lot, turned it on, and ended up crying when the login screen lit up. Kyle's tattoo looks like a toddler's doodle, by the way. Aunt Linda sent me a photo accidentally. The dragon's tail curved into an unrecognizable blob, and the artist even misspelled carpe diem underneath. I guess $2,000 doesn't buy quality these days. I'm still trying to figure out how to be a person without needing permission slips and how to eat meals that don't taste like guilt. Rick says I'll get there eventually. For now, I keep the laptop charged and my receipts in a shoebox labeled Brian in Sharpie, just in case. Now for the final update. It's been a month since my last update. A lot of you asked if things had ever settled down. The situation is complicated. Some days feel normal, while others still taste like burnt coffee. I'm starting to realize that normal might just be another label for whatever doesn't kill you. Last Tuesday, my dad came by the shop. I was replacing the brake pads on a '98 Corolla when Rick tapped my shoulder and nodded toward the office. My dad stood there in his work slacks with his shoulders slumped as if he'd been carrying too much. He mentioned that Kyle had been skipping rehab and that Mom was in therapy now, though she still made excuses for him. Then he admitted that he was struggling while rubbing his temple. I wiped the grease off my hands and replied that it wasn't my problem. His face tightened, but he didn't argue. He just turned and left. For a second, I almost felt bad seeing him look older, as if someone had cranked up the wrinkles on his face overnight. Later that night, Kyle texted me from a burner number with a taunting message that implied I had lost. I stared at it until the screen went dark. A part of me wanted to fight back by listing every sleepless night and every time a raised voice made me flinch, but instead I blocked the number. Rick later found me sitting on the garage steps with my knees pulled to my chest. Without asking a word, he just sat down, handed me a Coke, and pointed out constellations until my breathing evened out. The situation with the car still blows my mind. Rick had co-signed a loan for a used Honda, a dented silver car with 120,000 miles on it. He mentioned that I should pay him back when I graduated, casually tossing me the keys. When I offered to sign a contract, he waved the idea off, insisting that my word was enough. It was the first time someone had trusted me without making it a trap. 2 weeks ago, Mom mailed me an envelope. There was no return address, but I recognized her handwriting, loopy and rushed, like she was always late for something. Inside were photos of me as a kid riding a tricycle and of Kyle and me building a sandcastle, along with all the typical happy family snapshots. The note simply expressed that she missed me. I threw the envelope in the dumpster behind the shop, then fished it out an hour later, tore the photos to pieces, and left the remnants in the trash. I couldn't decide whether I was angry or just tired. Last weekend, I spotted Kyle at a gas station while I pulled in for a soda. There he was, wearing a red vest and scrubbing the windshield wiper blades. When our eyes met, he froze and then turned his back as though I were a stranger. He looked disheveled, his hair greasy, and he'd clearly gained some weight. I almost said something, really almost, but when the cashier rang up my drink, I just drove away. My dad's LinkedIn profile now listed him as a senior project coordinator instead of manager. Rick heard from a friend that my dad had been missing deadlines and showing up late, and there were even rumors that his boss was concerned about family distractions. It's funny how the shine on the golden child can sometimes tarnish everything. I finished my first semester with a 3.8, and Rick took me to a steakhouse downtown, the kind with cloth napkins and waiters who call you sir. He ordered a ribeye and told me to get whatever I wanted. I asked, half jokingly, if that meant even the lobster was on the menu, and he replied in a deadpan way that if I broke something, I'd have to buy it. We both laughed, and for once the celebration felt earned rather than borrowed. 3 days ago, Mom called, sobbing so hard that I could barely understand her. She explained that Kyle had moved in with a girlfriend and wouldn't answer her calls, comparing his behavior to what I remembered from her past. I held the phone tighter and mentioned that maybe he would come back in 10 years, just as I eventually had. The call ended abruptly, and I didn't try calling her back. The scholarship letter arrived yesterday, offering $1,500 for non-traditional students demonstrating resilience. I texted Rick, promising that I could pay him back faster now, and his reply came almost immediately with a few words expressing how proud he was of me. Though it was only 3 words, they struck me harder than any slap from my dad. Aunt Linda mentioned that Kyle was back on Dad's couch after his girlfriend dumped him following a credit card incident. Mom left a voicemail yesterday in which she expressed her regret in a small, deflated voice, and I ended up deleting it. Maybe someday that kind of vulnerability will feel like strength instead of fear. Last week, I bought Rick a vintage wrench set off eBay. When I handed it to him, he blinked quickly, cleared his throat, and hung it on the shop wall, explaining that it was for when I eventually took over. I'm still not sure if he meant the tools or the business. Maybe both. I'm learning to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. Some nights, I still dream about that torn-up gift card, but now the mornings smell like motor oil and coffee, and there's a laptop on my desk with a battery that lasts 3 whole hours. Progress, I guess.